Hello there, Evie here. Welcome to an air-cooled build in the Kolink Aviator M RGB. If you want to check out system specs, check them in the video description, or towards the end of the video where the thermal testing graphs show up and they'll be somewhere at the top. If you want to vote on future cases, check the straw poll link in the video description, or if you want to suggest any future components that I can try out, not necessarily cases, then let me know in the comments below. We'll start off with an initial look around the case straight out of the box, and then I'll go through the building procedure and let you know my thoughts and opinions as we go through it. Once we finish the build, we'll look at the results of the standard air-cooled testing, and then we'll do the maximum air-cooled testing by changing all the fans to high-performance fans and cramming the case full of them to see what this case can really do. Once we've gone through the testing, we'll do a nice fancy B-roll segment at the end, and then I'll wrap up with my final thoughts and opinions of the case, and I hope you enjoy it, so give me a thumbs up if you do, thumbs down if you don't, and comment on whether you do or don't like it, and what I can improve, or suggestions for future videos. So thanks for checking out the video so far, and I'll catch you for the commentary. Alright, let's do this. The Kolink Aviator M RGB is a micro ATX case that can support both mini ITX and micro ATX motherboards. It comes in packaging which you can see consists of cardboard, hard foam and a plastic bag, which is very much standard for a £40 or $50 case. At a first look, this case has quite a bold design with clearly defined lines, curves and a striking shiny front panel. However, the style seems to change up top where things get a little busier, with some LED light sources in various forms and some striped texturing and a ventilation panel. The offside panel has a larger than average extrusion, which is definitely going to help with cable management later, and up top of this side is the front I/O, which is the typical USB 3.0 and 2.0 ports, as well as the separate headphone and microphone jacks. In the centre is the power button, and up top on the window side is a reset switch and a combined LED fan colour and mode changer, which you'll see in action later. To the rear reveals the well-known bottom-mounted power supply top-mounted motherboard configuration, and one of the two included LED fans which have no indication of their speed, but they're not too loud, so I'm guessing around the 1000 RPM range. Opening her up, you can see what's coming, but first I wanted to show you this side panel. It's surprisingly sturdy for a case at this price, which is all thanks to the punched out section and really helps with replacing the panel later. Okay, now onto the inside of the case. There is first an absolute rat's nest of cables which can be made more sense of if we check the other side first. So, removing the other side panel requires the removal of two thumb screws, much like the first panel. It's worth mentioning that these thumb screws are pretty tough to remove, which is something that can be expected with cases around this price range. Also, this panel is really difficult to get off. It might get better with wear and tear over time, but for now I needed a tool to get it off in the first place. At a first glance, there appears to be plenty of room for cable management, but there's a big elephant in the room, which is this oversized LED fan controller panel, which can support up to 10 fans. This case can't even support up to 10 fans. And it's worth pointing out that it's held in place over a cable management hole by a double-sided foam strip over an undulating panel. Yeah. Anyway, the lower section offers holes through to the power supply unit and the rear of the hard disk drive cage, and to the right you can see mounting holes for a 2.5-inch hard disk drive. The left side provides plenty of accessibility through to the main compartment, and there is even a couple of ports at the top. As for the front of the case, this one was a damn difficult panel to take off lightly. It's designed to pop off since there isn't access to most of the clips from the inside, but it feels like one of the clips is going to snap off at any moment. However, I can say after doing this for a few times that nothing is broken off yet, so it does seem to work in some sort of fashion. Anyway, behind here you can gain access to the fixings of the two front fan positions. Now onto the main internals of the case. As mentioned before, we have a bottom mounted power supply unit position which has a filter for fan side down mounting. Above this are 5 snap-off PCI Express slot covers, which is a disappointment, and the top one seems to be replaced by a pack of screws, and above these is the included rear LED fan. Leaning the case back, we can see a position to mount a 120mm fan, which will sit right above the CPU cooler. And next to this is, well, it's a mess of front I/O and LED cables. Moving on swiftly, the majority of the motherboard standoffs are pre-installed, which is nice, none of which are holding posts, which is not as good but not essential. And to the lower right is a glimpse of the hard disk drive cage. The hard disk drive cage has included plastic sleds, which I'm pretty happy to see, and they slide in and out relatively easily enough. Nothing special, but a nice to have. Note that this is riveted into position, so it's not readily removable without some surgery. Note that I mentioned that you can actually remove things if you perform some sort of surgery on the case. Yeah, some guy in the comments before said that, well, you can actually remove rivets by taking a saw to them, so it's not even that difficult. But apparently I have to mention that sort of thing now, otherwise people will get up their own asses about it. Anyway, moving upwards is the second LED fan, and above this is the slot for another 120mm fan. You could put a radiator in here if you really wanted to, there is room. So before we get onto the build, let's check out the included accessories, which unfortunately is just screws. But it's enough for a first build, and that's really what this case is all about. Finally, time to start building. The first thing I like to throw in is the power supply unit, and I always try and go big. I mean, we're seeing what this case can do, so go big or go home, right? So starting off, I went for the 180mm long 80 plus platinum power supply unit, which I prefer since it's very quiet. But you could probably tell this would be very tight, so I soldiered on anyway. Getting it into position required removing all of the cables first, which is typical of most tight fits, but that's as far as I really got. Trying to connect all the cables to the back of the power supply unit in situ would have taken more time than I have to make these videos, if it could fit at all. So I recommend going for a standard ATX 160mm long power supply unit, and there's plenty of good ones around, so it's not that big of a loss. And there is plenty of benefit in this case, since you can just throw it in with all the cables attached. It might not have seemed apparent up until now, but this case really isn't very long. You'll see more of that later when we install the GPU. It was at this point that I made the decision to shift the rear fan to the front. I'm going to be adding a high performance fan into the system anyway, so I felt that having two lower performance fans up front and having one high performance fan to the rear was a better combination. I'll be doing the standard thermal test with this configuration, but I'll be swapping this back around for some visuals later on after the maximum thermal test. With the front I/O cables out of the way, I noticed this very recognisable wire in the bunch, which is a ground wire that should be attached to the case. So if you go ahead and get this case or any other case and find this wire not connected to anything, go ahead and find a spare hole to be able to screw it to the chassis. You may need a nut like I did to hold it in place securely. This will ground the top I/O panel with all the LEDs to the chassis, and the chassis is being grounded by the power supply unit, which is how it should be. Now there's room to breathe, the front fan can go in and be secured to the front of the case, and with the fan sorted out for now, we can prepare the case to take the motherboard. Tilting the case onto its side makes installing the motherboard easier, but be careful to not lay the case onto the fan's PCB. As we saw earlier, most of the standoffs are in position. However, these are set up for a typical mini ITX layout, so we need to move one down and add a couple more in to suit the micro ATX motherboard going in. Just before lowering the motherboard into the case, remember the I/O shield needs to be popped in, and with that out of the way we can drop the motherboard in and start securing it into position. Remember, you don't need to torque down on the screws into the standoffs. They only need to be tight enough so that they aren't going to unscrew themselves. The tighter they are, the more chance they'll have a stronger grip to the standoffs than the standoffs do to the case, and that's not a position you want to be in. So, with the bulk of the system in place and looking good, we can shift our attention to the hard disk drive cage. Removing the hard disk drive sleds is just a case of pinching and pulling, and with the sleds out of the cage, I'll be installing the two hard disk drives to the sleds using the provided screws. The sleds are a fairly typical design, but it's a feature I'm happy to see included. They can take both 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch drives, and I was fairly happy to see how securely the sleds are held into the cage. So with the hard disk drives ready to go back into the cage, there is only the SSD left to deal with. You probably wouldn't have seen much of the top of the hard disk drive cage earlier, but by installing these three screws provided to the bottom of the SSD, orientation is important here, we can secure it on top of the hard disk drive cage, which we'll see in a second. Since we know how the sleds work, we can skip replacing them, and also because I lost track of when the camera was recording, so I sort of missed it, and we can take a look at the installation of the SSD. The SSD can be slotted on top of the hard disk drive cage like so, and the final corner can be secured and prevent the drive from sliding back out with one screw into the side. Not an approach I've seen before, but it's pretty nifty and means the drive is secure on all sides without needing to remove the cage. Luckily, I managed to correct how the camera was recording in time to show you all of the drives in position. And with that dealt with, I'll quickly install the rear fan, which I'll gloss over as not to waste any of your time, and we can head to the back for the cable management. Remember, this is a small case, and with the extras that aren't necessary, like LED lighting and fan hubs and stuff like that, on top of the necessary power and data cables, this was quite a demanding task. Please don't hurt me. Okay, in my defense, the amount of cables that needed looping around just to use up the excess cable was demanding, and if they weren't all coiled around here, they would be in the main compartment, which is just a no-go. Also note that the LED fan hub size is ridiculous, but I also understand that this could be improved, and I'm sorry. Unfortunately for my fan hub, the top needed to be removed since it was preventing the side panel from going back on, which is okay since this is a fairly high riding hub. Now with the alleged cable management out of the way, we can strongly encourage the side panel into its place. To be fair, the cables are fixed fairly tight to the case, it has at least that going for it, but replacing the side panel was still fairly difficult. It's at this point that it's noticeable that the large punch-out area for the panel is compensating for the really small space between the motherboard tray and the edge of the chassis. That's disappointing since I was really looking forward to a well-catered cable management space. But I also recognise that the number of cables we're using is probably more than most would put in this case, but it does work and that's enough for me at this point. Finally, let's throw in the GPU. And this is the low point for me, oddly enough. Like I said earlier, these tabs aren't replaceable. It's okay considering the cost of the case, but even a cheap replacement panel would have been a nice inclusion. Slotting in the R9 390X really shows you how tight this case is. There's just over 15mm of space between the end of the GPU and the front fan. Once in place, we can use two of the provided screws to hold the GPU in place and replace this plastic cover, which turns out I didn't need to remove since there are holes for the screwdriver to go into, which clips to the back with some encouragement. Now with the GPU firmly in position, we can give it the previously routed 6-pin and 8-pin VGA power connectors and tuck the cables as far into the case as possible. Then we can replace the front panel for the first round of thermal testing, and we can follow this up by replacing the windowed side panel, securing it in place with the screws removed at the start of this video. So, thermal testing results, what can I say? Well, it lasted in a similar tone to the Cooler Master Masterbox Lite 3.1 we tested last week, in the sense that the CPU didn't last very long. Only this time it lasted 1.5 minutes before the CPU started to thermal throttle, and we came across issues where I really didn't want to put the CPU through. So I paused the test for the CPU at that point, but I continued the GPU test further on, and it managed to complete the test and come out at around 94 degrees. Compare that to all the cases tested so far, and we're not looking at great results, but slightly better than the Masterbox Lite 3.1, which is interesting. However, all of that thermal throttling is most likely down to the very small ventilation zone at the front. So the obvious question is, can we improve this? And one way to find the answer is to try and maximize the airflow through the case. We're going to change all the stock fans to 2200 RPM EK Vardar fans and add another fan to the top. We could try a different CPU cooler, but on an open air test bench with the Hyper 212 Evo, the 6700K can be cooled down to 78 degrees, so it would appear that the bottleneck here is airflow. Removing the top panel here is a bit difficult. The best way I found was to get some sort of flathead tool and pry between the top of the chassis and the top panel. Now the top panel is free hanging off the side, you'll have access to install the top 120mm fan. I'm installing this one in an exhaust configuration, so there should be equal pressure airflow between this fan, the other exhaust fan to the rear, and the two front intake fans. So with these faster fans in position, the CPU lasted twice as long, before thermal throttling became a constant issue. It's also worth noting that to get this performance improvement, these three fans cost as much as the case. So this case really is for the 65 watt TDP or lower CPUs if you'll be running any CPU intensive tasks. Comparing these results to the other cases tested shows the same results as the previous test. So let's move on to the B-roll footage and I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. So I think we can safely say this case is better suited to the first time builder. It's affordable and is not too difficult to build in, and depending on the length of your GPU, you'll be able to fit in a 240mm AIO cooler for future growth. And if the looks of the Kolink Aviator M RGB suit your desires, just make sure you're not a high CPU power user before picking this one up. So thank you for those who have made it this far, and just for you, I'd like to let you know that by popular vote, the Fractal Design Node 804 will be up next for air cooling, and soon after, water cooling. I've got a few changes to the water cooling roster lined up, so it should be a good one. Let me know if you liked the video with a thumbs up, and make sure you subscribe to check out more videos like this one in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.